Dear friends and comrades, I am really glad to be for the first time in Toronto, in Canada. At the same time, I am very disappointed that just recently the Italian philosopher Antonio Negri and even more recently Chelsea Manning was not allowed to come to Canada, and I think we should all strongly condemn this. You have all read or watched Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, and if you did, and I guess here in Canada most of you did, you will remember that in the United States there is a totalitarian system, sounds familiar, and that at the same time Canada is the place which still serves as a refuge and as a safe haven. Incidentally or not, in 1935, Sinclair Lewis, in another dystopian novel called It Can't Happen Here, also used precisely Canada as the place where people take refuge, going away and hiding from the totalitarian state of the United States. As we can see with the recent developments with Tony Negri and with Chelsea Manning, this is obviously changing. There are no safe havens anymore, and the whole globe, from the US to the United States, from Russia to Turkey, is rapidly turning into a totalitarian nightmare. I just came from Europe, where I incidentally was born and where I live most of the time, and Europe is falling apart. It's not anymore only that you have right-wing extremists, they call it populists, but I would call it fascist or neo-Nazi parties in Hungary or in Poland. If you have seen the recent German election results with something which is called Alternative für Deutschland gaining 13% at the elections, then you can see that neo-Nazi parties are becoming more and more powerful in the very heart of Europe. In France, in Germany, where the AfD now is part of the German Bundestag. However, it would be wrong to believe that this, what I would call fascist international, from the US to the EU, has fallen out of the blue sky. It is a reaction to the financial crisis of 2007-2008, our generation's 1929, and the failed response, which was the neoliberal response. So in a way, what we have to do today, I think, and this is very important, is to see this fascist international as an answer to something what we might call the neoliberal austerity international. In that way, Trump is an answer to the failed politics of Obama and to the promise of Hillary Clinton, of course. AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, is an answer to Merkel and Schäuble. Le Pen is an answer to Hollande. In other words, both the fascist international and the neoliberal international are actually two sides of the same coin. They depend on each other, and they reinforce each other. So what is the solution? The solution is maybe to be found in an old joke from old communist times, when a listener of the famous Radio Yerevan calls the radio and asks, which tea is better, Chinese or Soviet tea? And the answer of Radio Yerevan is, don't get involved in the confrontation between superpowers, drink coffee. What we should do today is to invent, metaphorically speaking, this coffee. The point of the joke is that it is a false dilemma to choose between the fascist international and the neoliberal international. It is a false dilemma to choose between Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. It is a false dilemma to choose between Angela Merkel and the failed German policies in the Eurozone, and on the other hand of the rising neo-Nazi parties. What we have to do, similarly to the joke, is to drink coffee, which means to invent a third option. A third space which is not belonging neither to the fascist international, neither to the austerity international. So the answer is actually that we have to invent a new international movement. And the good news is that this new international movement is already in the rise. It is already rising on both sides of the Atlantic. It is rising with Black Lives Matter in the US, with the Bernie Sanders movement. It is rising in the UK with the reformed Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. It is rising on the streets of Catalonia, where tomorrow they have a referendum. It is rising all around Europe with the DiEM25 movement, Democracy in Europe movement. And in this sense, I think also that these events, like this event here, are also important. I agree partially, I still have 4 minutes, so I can give a short reference to my dear friend Gayatri Spivak. I agree with Gayatri when she says that we have to stop pretending that we are radicals. We have to stop pretending that the revolution can be born in a theater. But at the same time, when politics is turning into theaters, as we can see with Trump or in Europe as well with Macron as well, if you want, and Merkel, we have to bring politics back to theaters. And when Spivak says that, you know, this event, for instance, is sponsored by corporations and so on, well, I have to say that I flew in from Europe by Air Canada. There are no other flights. I mean, there are other companies, but, you know, it's the same choice as choosing between Pepsi or Coca-Cola. And what I think, you know, maybe the revolution won't be born here, but I think that we have to use all means possible, which means that we have to use theaters, we even have to use corporate money, use it precisely against them, in order to invent something. But I think what is the most urgent task, to finish even before my time is off, so we can maybe spend some time on questions, the most urgent tasks today is to connect the existing movements. Because what you can see is that there is a new international movement, a new realigned movement, if you want, on both sides of Atlantic, but usually they are not connected. The struggle in Catalonia is usually not perceived as a global struggle, or the cooperatives which exist in Spain. The movement of the Kurds in Rojava is not directly connected to the Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn movement. Grassroots movements or indigenous movements in North America and South America are also not connected to grassroots movement or indigenous movements in Europe. What we have to do today is to connect all these movements, because the only answer to the false dilemma between the Fascist International and the Austerity International is to create a new global resistance and liberation movement. Thanks a lot. You can play for 2 minutes. Hi.
Hi. So how do we function in the world if there's no longer any safe havens? And when you talk about the corporations, how do we engage them to be complicit in this new movement?
Well, it's a $1 million question, but when I'm saying this, you know, when you witness, for instance, the so-called Greek Spring, the situation which started when Syriza took power in Greece 2015, or even Brexit. Amongst the radical left, there is this idea, conviction that it's possible to exit, be it Grexit, be it the Brexit, and so on. And even among some anarchists, there is the idea in Spain, in France, that it's possible to exit global capitalism. I think this is the most dangerous illusion, because it's not possible to exit capitalism. We are using mobile phones, we are using Instagram, we are using Facebook, and so on. My answer to this is subversion. What we have to do is subversion. For instance, in Croatia, which was part of Yugoslavia, we used to run something what we call the Subversive Festival, with guests such as Oliver Stone, Alexis Tsipras, Yanis Varoufakis, Aleida Guevara, many, many others. And you know from whom we took money? From Peugeot, from Deutsche Telekom, and so on. I still remember a situation where we had an ex-terrorist on the stage, my good friend Karl-Heinz Delvaux from the Rote Armee Fraktion from Germany, who spent 20 years in prison. And then someone, a very subversive guy from the audience, asked the question, what would the young Karl-Heinz Delvaux say if he would see the old Karl-Heinz Delvaux who is at stage now, and behind on the stage is a logo from the Deutsche Telekom? And you know what Karl-Heinz Delvaux said? Well, before we had to go to the banks and take the money out of the banks, now the banks are giving us money. And the same guy then asked a question, okay, but what do you say that Deutsche Telekom is the sponsor? And then Delvaux said, what mobile corporation are you using? which is, you know, what I think today what we have to do. This is also not the answer. This is not the answer how to start a revolution. But by the way, the guy who started the revolution in Russia 100 years ago wouldn't start it without German money, or without Ford as well, if you want. So what we have to do, I think, is use it ruthlessly, all the money possible, because it's impossible to make a revolution without money.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks.